Let's talk about the most beautiful chords in jazz. When I was first getting into jazz, then just the basic 7th chords already sounded amazing. But then you realize that you can actually add a lot of color to those chords, and you can create something like this beautiful minor 7 chord with a 9th. And you can do that for the entire 2-5-1 progression that then sounds like this. But then you discover that in the songs there are these other chord progressions that are even more mysterious and beautiful, like this one. And this group of chords is what I want to talk about in this video. They're often described as modal interchange or borrowed chords, but let me show you why that is maybe not a very precise description. This group of chords is called the minor subdominants, and the basic version of it is actually pretty easy to understand if you start with this cowboy or country progression. Imagine that our hero, the cowboy, is at home. Now he has a car that he really loves, and he wants to go for a ride, but then the car breaks. But luckily his horse comes to save him. I'm sure you can hear how this progression has a very natural flow, but you probably also noticed that there are a few chords in there that are not in the C major scale, because the diatonic chords of C major would be these. And usually the most interesting chords are the chords that are not in the scale but still in the key, because key and scale is not the same thing. The key is a much larger and more complicated place than the scale, which is just 7 notes. The star of the cowboy progression is of course the F minor chord, which is a surprising but beautiful sound that leads us back to the C. But where does that chord actually come from? One way to look at this is that the F minor chord is borrowed from C minor. So when you have a chord progression in C major, then you can use the chords of C major, but you can actually also borrow chords from C minor, which is especially useful for the subdominant and the dominant chords. But later I'm going to show you how this is a simplified explanation and actually goes further than that with a lot more interesting chords. And already here you have a lot of material to work with. The minor subdominants would be F minor 7, A flat major 7, B flat 7, and D half diminished. And you can do incredible things using the minor subdominants as a way to get back to the 1 chord instead of a dominant chord. All this where the B flat 7 is what is commonly described as the backdoor dominant, something that I'll come back to later. But there are more options, and some of the most common ones don't really come from the C minor scale at all. A question that I get quite often when I'm talking about this topic is, when is something a minor subdominant? And that's a little difficult to nail completely, because in tonal harmony, then the function of a chord depends on what's happening around it. So you can't just list some notes and then use that to decide what the function of the chord is. Let me show you an example. Here the B flat 7 is the backdoor dominant, so it's resolving back to C major 7, but it could actually also be a part of a cadence to the 2 chord, to D minor. That would sound like this. And here it's not a subdominant, it's a dominant function that is a secondary dominant to the A7 that is then taking us to the D minor. So when is something a minor subdominant? I guess the best definition would be it can resolve to a tonic chord. It contains the flat 6 of the scale, so in the key of C major that would be an A flat. It's not a dominant chord, which mostly means that it doesn't contain the leading note, that would be a B, and it will often contain the root C. As you can tell, it's not just a matter of certain notes being in there. Let's widen the net a bit and look at what is actually going on before looking at how to use these chords. I already hinted at this. The explanation with borrowing chords from the minor scale doesn't really explain what's going on, and that's because this really comes from voice leading. Let me show you how that works with the cowboy example and how it's going to give us some more really beautiful chords. Now I'm going to play this in a different position because I think that's going to make it easier to follow what's going on. The progression starts on the C, and then I want to go to F, so I'm introducing a secondary dominant, that's the C7 that takes us to the F. Now from the F I want to go back to C, and one way to do that is of course just to add a little bit of chromatic voice leading. So I take the A and then I change that to an A flat so that it resolves smoothly down to G, the 5th of the C chord. Now this is really how we get that F major going to F minor and then resolving to C. It is about a melodic movement inside the chords, so it's horizontal, not vertical chords that are changing. And that's also why modal interchange or borrowed chords from minor are not a really precise description, because they're talking about chords that are changing and not about this flow that's happening across several chords. So why is this better? It's better because you can now have other melody notes and more interesting minor subdominant chords. Let's first look at a few variations of chords that I already mentioned, and then I'll add a completely new one as well. So of course I'm talking about C major here, and a common melody note in C major is the major third E. Now if you want to harmonize that, then it doesn't really make sense to think of a chord from C minor, because that scale doesn't have an E, it has an E flat. But if you think of the minor subdominant in the way that I just talked about it as a voice leading thing, then you can actually do something like this. And for the B flat 7, then that E becomes the sharp 11, which is a great sound for a dominant. And you can actually check that this is how you will see these chords appear in jazz standards, like this one in There'll Never Be Another You, or this one in It Could Happen to You. So now we have F minor major 7, B flat 7 and F minor 6 in there as well. And the scale that makes the most sense with these would be F melodic minor. And again, an example of how it isn't really modal interchange or borrowed chords. It's not a vertical thing, it's voice leading. Using this, then we can actually construct a completely new minor subdominant chord. I'm going to show you this one in the jazz way, because the classical way is not really how we use it that often. Let's start with another subdominant chord, D minor 7. D minor 7 moving down to C major 7. But it would be nice to have that chromatic movement in there, so A moving to A flat down to G. And of course this actually means that we're playing D minor 7 to D half diminished to C major 7. And these half steps moving in there are just really nice. We can actually have one more in there, so D minor 7, and then when the A moves down to A flat, I can also move D to D flat. That gives me D flat major 7 moving down to C major 7. This is the jazz version of the Neapolitan subdominant, and another great option. The difference is that usually the classical version has an F in the bass. These chords can do a lot of things, and of course it's useful to understand what's happening in the harmony of songs like There Will Never Be Another You or It Could Happen to You, but you can also use the minor subdominants for your own songs and for reharmonizing songs to make them more personal. And you can work on inserting these as a surprising and different sound in place of almost any chord. So here are a few examples. You can use a minor subdominant instead of a normal subdominant. Maybe use a flat 6 major 7 instead of a 2 minor 7 chord in tune up. The original sounds like this. But check out how this sounds. And if you use the flat 7, so the backdoor dominant, instead of the 5 chord in I Fall in Love Too Easily, then you go from this to this. And you can even use minor subdominants as a beautiful suspension of the tonic chord, like this in Days of Wine and Roses. You can hear how these chords sound amazing for making melodies surprising and fresh, but that's not going to be useful for you if you don't know how to harmonize melodies and make your own chord melody arrangements, something that is an important part of the jazz guitar skill set, and that people like Joe Pass and Barney Kessel have almost made into a separate style. If you want to start working on that skill so that you can arrange a song into a complete piece of music, then you need to check out this video.